The film Groundhog Day presents us with an almost perfect thought experiment to illustrate many of Aristotle's ideas that are central to his Nicomachean ethics. Okay, there is one scene from the movie that deviates from Aristotle's golden mean, and I'd be remiss to ignore it. On the last night, Phil and Rita run into Ned while leaving a party. It's revealed that Phil bought every form of insurance that Ned was selling. This may or may not be an example of virtuous behavior on Phil's part. If Phil really needed all of it, then maybe choosing to purchase it from Ned was a virtuous decision. Maybe even if he just bought what he needed and a little bit more, it might have still been virtuous. But if he was just doing it to make Ned feel good on a rotational time loop basis, it may have been an example of disingenuous extravagance, which would be vicious on Aristotle's account. After all, what is extravagance if not making major purchases of things that we don't really need? But don't let that take away from the rest of the film. It's otherwise a great Nicomachean ethics thought experiment with tremendous value. Indeed, it's one thing to read the Nicomachean ethics and think that it sounds plausible, but watching the effects of vice and virtue play out in the film helps quite a bit. Okay, that caveat aside, let's get back into it. At the beginning of the film, we're introduced to Phil Connors, a television weatherman. We'll have to do some amateur psychoanalysis on the character for the sake of this discussion, so bear with me if you disagree with any points in this lecture. Besides the lecture on all kinds of killing, I typically try to reserve my personal views and just report and analyze what's available in the literature. So please don't take anything I said in the lectures on war and sex, for example, as me expressing my personal beliefs. But this lecture is different, because it's a summary of my analysis of the film. Phil appears to be a vicious person, in Aristotelian terms, from the outset of this picture. That is, Phil is smart enough to know his behavior is vicious, but he does it and he wants to do it anyway. In fact, he seems to revel in it. He's short with his colleagues, he insults them, he even sexually harasses them. He's not a good person. Usually people like this never change. I'm sure we can all think of people who suck that seem beyond saving. Indeed, between our personal lives, the media, and politics, cruel, lying, and cheating people abound. And even with a whole lifetime to figure out how to be a good person, some of these people never will. Try to keep that in mind. But let's say, for the sake of discussion, that Phil is, at the start of the film, vicious. He knows what he does is wrong, and he wants to do it anyway. That's the mark of a vicious person for Aristotle. And Phil continues in his viciousness well into the time loop he finds himself trapped in, that constitutes the bulk of the film. After a period of self-pity, Phil leans into his vices, exploiting his knowledge of this single day to have sex with presumably every woman in town that he has any interest in, stealing money from armored vehicles, and living out personal fantasies.
Call me Bronco.
Sorry, Bronco.
At this point in the film, it may seem that Phil has only been in the time loop a short time, but consider he has already deviated from his normal workday. He's memorized people's comments, dogs' barks, and even gusts of wind. He's been in there for a while, months at least. How many months of doing whatever you want would it take before you got tired of it? When would the time loop become unbearable for you? We'll return to this idea later. But Phil, as he revels in his viciousness, begins to feel empty, and starts pursuing Rita, who's been the film's exemplar of kindness, virtue, and truth. What more could you ask for? Recall that Phil would turn to Rita whenever he had a problem, either professionally or personally. Rita is the light in his life, whether he realizes it or not. He pursues her because of this. Despite his viciousness, he recognizes the good in Rita, and he needs it. Nothing else will make him feel whole, and he knows it. At this point in the film, Phil may not actually be vicious anymore. He may be going through a quick transitional phase of what Aristotle calls incontinence, which means he knows what's good and maybe even wants to do good, but he's giving in to what's base anyway. After hundreds of failed attempts to seduce Rita, Phil finally starts to lose it again. He attempts suicide multiple times before he again turns to Rita, the film's exemplar of virtue. He breaks down and confides in her in one of the most beautiful scenes in the film. Phil finally knows Rita, and that's a big deal because truly knowing someone is such a special, rare, and rarely sustainable thing. When he confides in her and tries to convince her of his situation, he tells her he knows all about her. He tells her, you like boats, but not the ocean.
You go to a lake in the summer with your family up in the mountains. There's a long wooden dock and a boathouse with boards missing from the roof, and a place you used to crawl underneath to be alone. You're a sucker for French poetry and rhinestones. You're very generous. You're kind to strangers and children. And when you stand in the snow, you look like an angel.
Finally getting to know Rita and understanding the misery that accompanies vice, Phil starts to transition from incontinence to continence. The continent person is one who desires what is base, but overcomes their lesser desires because they value what's good. Phil is in a special and unique situation here. None of us get the benefit of living more than one lifetime, but Phil has. Most of us never get the opportunity to learn we've been playing for the wrong team. We've been doing what's wrong for the wrong reasons. And we can't go back and fix any of it. But after so many years in the time loop, Phil is responsive to Rita's advice. She is, after all, as I've said, the moral exemplar and virtuous light in Phil's life. And virtue is the only thing that can save him. Rita says something important to Phil.
Sometimes I wish I had 1,000 lifetimes. I don't know, Phil. Maybe it's not a curse. It just depends on how you look at it.
Gosh, you're an upbeat lady.
And despite the depth of his depression, he can't help but feel comforted by her kindness and optimistic outlook. She sees the potential good of the situation. She recognizes it for the opportunity it is, and Phil knows he can trust her. From there, this turning point in the film, Phil starts to recognize all the potential opportunities to do good in the world around him, and he dedicates himself to it. A good depiction of this transition from continence towards virtue is when he stops to finally help the old man he's passed by every day. He starts to count out cash to give him, but pauses. He knows he doesn't need the money, and it would likely be a great help to the old man, so he hands it all over. This man will eventually show Phil he was wrong about something else. Phil told Rita earlier that he believed himself to be a god.
I'm a god.
This declaration is mostly intended to show that he's been driven a bit insane, and that godhood is his best explanation for the time loop. But it could also be a reflection of his hubris, or the vice of excessive pride, lingering despite his helplessness. After his moment with Rita, Phil began his turn towards the good, but he still believed he could do whatever he wanted, basically omnipotent. But no matter what he tried, the old man died every day. Phil learned that he was not a god, finally opening him up to the humility that's needed for wisdom and virtue. The Aristotelian conception of the good also dictates that we develop ourselves, which Phil does. He develops himself through the studies of language, literature, art, music, many of the things we have the opportunity to pursue in our undergraduate studies. But Phil also has unlimited time, so he's able to learn other things with more instrumental value, like chiropractic work, and fixes a man's back, earning the title Dr. Connors with some of the locals. He also learns the Heimlich maneuver to save another man's life. In short, Phil earns the respect and admiration of everyone in town and elevates himself to an intellectual and moral level that's consistent with Aristotle's conception of Eudaimonia. Of course, all of these feats, learning music, language, arts, and so many others are daunting, and he clearly had to overcome some of them, perhaps during his undergraduate studies. If you're not from the United States, some of this might seem strange, but not all of us are multilingual. We require undergraduate students to satisfy language, art, math, and science requirements. With the level of expertise he attained in languages, arts, music, it's hard to believe he didn't spend a few years trying to master each of them, making it even more difficult to figure out how long he's been in this time loop. But he's a lifetime more educated, he's at peace, and he's confident. He even walks around with an air of enlightenment about him. He knows he's been doing what's right. He's doing good at this point. Aristotle was clear that facts of the world outside of our control can impact our ability to flourish. And now that Phil has become virtuous, it seems like the only thing between him and Eudaimonia is the time loop that made his attainment of virtue possible in the first place. I think Phil can see this too. In one of the final scenes he says, "No matter what happens tomorrow, or for the rest of my life, I'm happy now, because I love you." He's achieved what so many of us never achieve. He's transcended vice to become virtuous. He's gone from a bad person to a good person. Think back to your previous examples of people from your life, the media, and politics, who absolutely suck. Phil was once like these vicious exemplars who will never learn virtue, because, and this is an underlying message in the film, for most of us, one life is not enough. Even though none of us will ever have the opportunity Phil had in the time loop, we do have the benefit of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, and if we take virtue ethics seriously, we can use our undergraduate time just as Phil did. As undergraduates, we must satisfy electives and prerequisites, and these are relevantly analogous to Phil's period of independent study working towards Eudaimonia. We also interact with people from various backgrounds, who are also trying to better themselves, giving us the opportunity to exercise our moral virtues, which really just translates to being cool to people we meet. And I don't think this suggestion is too much to ask. Focus on your studies, apply yourself, don't be a and with a bit of luck, you might be able to propel yourself towards Eudaimonia.